Hi, I'm Max Dubstep, and I don't make dubstep. In fact, I don't know what I make, but here's how I make it. So, initially this track was made for Andrew Huang's 4 Producers 1 sample series, and the entire track is made out of the source sample. So I faced the challenge of making every sound in this project out of one sample. Here's how I approached it, starting with the kick. With percussion sounds for kick and snare, I grabbed some small pieces of audio from practically random parts of the source sample, and I stretched them using texture mode. Here's what the sample I used for kick sounds like. Nothing like a kick at all. So to make it sound more kicky, I applied an EQ with one band with its gain cranked up to the ceiling and automated frequency. The frequency follows an envelope that any usual kick sub would follow. And just with that EQ, it already sounds a lot more like a kick. Next up is just some basic processing like transient shaping, EQ, removing resonance with soothe, volume automation using a utility, then saturation, and isotope trash. I don't consider isotope trash saturation, I consider it a tone shaper, because it has a multi-band mode which lets you, well, distort every part of the spectrum separately and give it a new tone. For example, here's what the kick would sound without the isotope trash, and with it. Next up, once again, basic processing, EQing, multi-band compression, and saturation once again. For the snare, I needed a sound that had both a tone and noise, so I grabbed this sound. So what I did is I added more noise with redux, erosion, and vinyl distortion. Next up, I used frequency shifter to give it some attack. And then once again, just basic processing. With multi-band compression, especially on percussion sounds, I really like to have a lot of high-end on the transients and more low and mids on the body of the sound. So here you can see that in the difference between attacks for the high band and the mid band. Followed by some more processing, sounds like this. Then I bounced that to audio, applied some more processing, and here's what the final snare sound sounds like. I used this sample throughout the entire track, except for some hits, I chopped it shorter and pitched it down to make ghost notes. Next up, I needed some hi-hats, and thankfully in the beginning of the source sample there was sound that to me sounded like some easy hi-hats even on their own. So I grabbed that with very little processing at first, just frequency shifting, redux to give it more noise, and EQing. But afterwards I thought that the sound was very short and every hit lacked tail, so I added it using convolution reverb. And yes, the sample I used in that convolution reverb also was made using the source sample. After that I applied more transient shaping, EQing, saturation, then echo delay with ping pong mode to give it some stereo, more saturation, and then I thought that now the sound had too much tail, so I reduced it using a utility and shaper. Next up, I needed a bass sound, and I've achieved it by grabbing a tiny piece of audio and repeating it a lot of times, basically turning it into an oscillator. So that's exactly what I did here, except I did not only use one instance of that sample, but two, and the second one was pitched down an octave, and it had flipped polarity. That put through a lot of distortion, started to sound like a very aggressive bass sound. But it was very boring and kind of like an 808, so to make it sound more interesting, I mixed in some noise, chorus, and I've also added grain delay that I paired with the dry signal and used a gate to gate it to the dry signal. And I just recorded that sound, put it in simpler, and used throughout the entire track. Except in some spots, to spice things up, I have added another simpler instance, and in the sample controls, I've added a filter with a really fast LFO to give it a wobbly sound. And that, paired with the first bass, gave this sound. For For the lead sound, I did a little bit of a weird thing. So usually if people would follow an approach that I followed here, they would find a piece of audio that just has the perfect wave shape that can be turned into an oscillator and use that. But instead, I found a piece of audio that had a little click at the beginning, and by doing so, I have achieved a sound that had a bit of a rotating feeling to it, because there's always this click that plays again and again and again, and the higher the note is, the faster the click happens. That went through distortion, EQing, reverb, and then I did one interesting thing with Soothe. Usually people use Soothe to reduce resonances, but instead here I added it to accentuate them. And to do so, I put it on the delta mode and paired it with the dry signal. And with a bit more of EQing, distortion, compressing and all that, I have achieved a lead sound. Except it was very dragged out and it didn't fit in some places. So what I did is I recorded the entire lead part and chopped it up, occasionally applying random effects like beat crushing, auto panning, chorus, reverb and all that. Then one sound that plays along with the lead was also achieved by grabbing a tiny piece of audio and repeating it a lot. I used a lot of reverb and echo. Here you can see Pro Reverb 2, grain delay, 2 instances of Echo Boy, and here you can see echo, but it is disabled. That is because it was only used to record more sounds. Because if you crank up the feedback and manually tweak the filter while it's playing, you can get some funky sounds like this. So I did a little jam session and got some sounds that I used as textures in some transitions. And that screaming sound right here later became kind of the core sound of the second drop. It was just put through more distortion and EQing, and here's what it sounds like. Next interesting sound I had was achieved by basically grabbing the entire source sample and putting into a simpler on slice mode. And then I did a quick setup that would just trigger random notes. Which could have easily been used as a percussion sound, but instead, midway through processing, I put spectral resonator and fed it MIDI from a separate lane, and that has absolutely transformed the sound. So once again, played some melodies with that, recorded, and chopped it up to make it snappier. Now we come to a sound that was achieved by using a quite weird and interesting technique. So I got another sound by using a small piece of audio that I turned into an oscillator. I once again put it in simpler, but I didn't play melodies with it. Instead, I put it on loop mode, and using an LFO, I changed the length of that loop, which gave an interesting result. That, once again recorded, refined a little, pitched up, sounds like this. Now, while I was working on this project, my friend Inticus has made a plugin in Max for Live, and he sent it to me and I thought, why don't I just utilize that plugin in this project? So I grabbed the source sample and run it through just the plugin, which looks like this. I have no idea what the plugin does or how it works, but if you just randomly tweak the knobs, sometimes it outputs audio. So just with this plugin alone, I was able to basically extend the source sample 5 times and get even more sounds that sound just as crazy as the source sample. Then I once again put the entirety of what I recorded in simpler, and with once again a setup that would trigger random notes, got this. Which this time I decided to use just as a percussion sound. There were also instances of using what I recorded as filler sounds, risers, and even sounds that got their own little lead rolls. Alright, I think I covered the most interesting sounds. I won't cover everything because I don't want the video to be half an hour long, but that was how I turned one sample into a whole song. Now you get to listen to it. That's it. I hope you enjoyed it, and the track will be out on platforms eventually.